Now back to the show. This is AM 650's The Law Show.
Personal injury law is the subject of the conversation on this episode of The Law Show with Scott Stanley and Kevin Gorley from Murphy Battista in Vancouver. We're talking about getting your life back. Scott, you and I have talked about this many times in the past. That's basically what the firm attempts to do for those clients it takes on and represents. And we were just talking moments ago about this case, this very large award, Kevin, that you and Scott worked on at trial for what, a month, guys? You were actually in the courtroom every day for a good month, but you were on the file for 5 or 6 years, and well, it's not over yet. When a firm, a big Vancouver firm, takes on a case like this that you know is going to take a long time to resolve, but likely, in the case of a $6 million award, could be favorably resolved, how does the firm adjust to a case like this? Because here's a very successful, we're talking about a doctor who was in a car accident and as a result of that unable to practice any longer. Doctors make pretty good dough, and so thus the large award. But that's a lot of years without any income into that household, and you already said, Scott, he had children, and clearly there's a family going on. So how does the firm adjust to taking on a case like that? Because you make an enormous commitment to the client and their families.
Well, our motto is we want to help people get their lives back. But
Right.
The reality of it is that we're not always successful. People don't always get their life back. I mean, we want to create an environment where they can have the maximum potential for recovery. But by the time this fella came to be our client, that had sort of come and gone.
Right.
And we made some residual efforts. But what we want to do, knowing that this is going to be a long, hunker down, get in your foxhole kind of battle,
Right.
we want to make sure that the family's stabilized. And so we will work with our clients, make sure that they have access to all the disability insurance they have available to them, the ICBC insurance. We'll retain occupational therapists, counselors to help them adjust to their new rules, their new disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of our clients, they're probably most impressed with that aspect of our work than they are with the actual financial recovery.
And Kevin, I guess at Scott's point about, in some cases, it's not possible to restore or to give that client his or her life back due to the debilitating nature of the injuries they've sustained. However, obviously, you're going to try and get as close to that original point as you can. And I guess some clients are easier to deal with in terms of that reality, adjusting to the fact that it may not ever be what it once was.
All you can hope for is what they call the maximum medical recovery. And that is, to get there, you want the people to see the right doctors, the right occupational therapists, the
Sure.
right counselors, the right psychologists, whatever, depending on the nature of the injury, to get to the best point that they can get to following the accident or the injury.
Mm-hmm.
Money only goes so far. And when somebody is going to be disabled for the rest of their lives and there's nothing that the medical profession can do to get them back to the way they were before the accident, then that gap between who they are post-accident and who they were before the accident can only try to be filled with a monetary recovery. But that's never going to be good enough. It's
Right.
never good enough to have that instead of who you were before the accident.
Yeah, people with brain injuries are some of the more difficult ones to work with because, and Joe Murphy's talked about this on the show before, if someone comes into us and said, I've got a brain injury and here, this, that, and the other thing, you're going to be suspicious that they probably don't. But if the person comes in and says, I'm fine, it's all good, no problems here. People with brain injuries typically have very, very poor insight into the problems they have. And one of the biggest struggles we have is helping them identify for themselves that they do have these problems,
Right.
so that they
Just
can
come to terms with it.
come to terms with it, and then we can develop strategies to deal with those problems.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about hiring a lawyer. We promised we were going to before we took the break, and so when someone, first of all, when should we even consider hiring a lawyer? Now, let's, first of all, even before that, Murphy Battista handles personal injury cases, about 70 to 75% of which are as a result of traffic accidents of some kind. Correct, Scott?
That's correct.
Okay. And the most severe injuries out of that very large number not generally, but can from time to time involve alcohol-related traffic issues too, can't they?
Yeah, I think of the severe injuries in our office, a very high proportion of those relate to alcohol use.
Okay, let me set aside my question about hiring a lawyer and skip to the other one that's bugging me. And this is that decision by the BC Court of Appeals within the last 2 weeks to support the government's provincial statute on the matter of roadside suspensions. There was an appeal. A fellow had his license lifted and his car impounded because he flunked the roadside breath test. He either blew fail or caution is the other point. Isn't it, Kevin? Isn't it caution? There are 2 categories that the police on the roadside will go, okay, pull it over, you're done.
Yep.
And so this guy blew one of the 2, had his car impounded, and appealed it on the basis of, well, wait a second, since when is a police officer at the roadside judge, jury, and executioner? Don't we in this country have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty? So this was the basis of the appeal. And Kevin, you have some thoughts on that. I can tell by the expression on your face already.
Well, what happened is, as most people have some knowledge, the provincial government some years ago introduced this legislation that essentially allows police officers to stop people and issue these roadside prohibitions when they blow over .05.
Right.
The criminal code provision being at .08.
Right.
So it allows essentially the immediate imposition of the penalty in the impounding of the vehicle and the immediate suspension of the driver's license. And people have the ability to challenge these after the fact. And there's been a great deal of litigation over the past few years up to this most recent Court of Appeal decision, and I assume we're not going to be done there, over essentially the constitutionality of these roadside prohibitions.
Right, and the other part about it, though, Scott, that still confuses people, and I know you have some very strong thoughts about this, about zero tolerance as exists in many parts of the world, but in Canada, federal law, the criminal code, says you're drunk and should be busted for it at .08. Here in British Columbia, we've decided, no. We're going down. We're going to lower that threshold to .05. So there are some going, well, wait a second. Don't we live in Canada? Doesn't .08 supersede .05? And where does that fall legally?
Well, 08 still exists everywhere in Canada. That's a criminal law. It's a federal law, so it applies everywhere. It applies in Saskatchewan, BC, even Quebec.
Okay.
Even Quebec.
For the moment.
For the moment. But and that law is still there, but that law is administratively not workable. And it's very, very difficult to secure a conviction. It's very, very expensive. You would think you haul Joe Blow in, you get him to blow, it's .08.
Yeah, the needle goes wham off the end, done.
It's not. Those are actually very complex cases to secure a conviction. They take a lot of time from the investigating officers. Mm-hmm. They take a lot of judicial resources, and the conviction rate is very low.
Okay.
And for the people that are convicted, it's quite punitive. They lose their license for a year. And I actually like this better because it's immediate. It gets people off the road. Mm-hmm. The police are going to be invested in this because they're actually going to see some results. I mean, it's defeating if you're doing these investigations and you're not getting convictions. But here, they're doing important work. They're actually getting people with alcohol in their system off the road right away. And I think for the people that are sanctioned, this is vastly superior to losing your license for a year and having to spend thousands of dollars on a criminal lawyer.
I suppose there's also a confusion about rights and privileges here. Your right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, that's a right. But to drive, to receive permission and a license to drive is not a right. It's a privilege, which can be revoked much easier than a right, one would assume, Scott.
That's exactly the analysis. It's not a right to drive a car. It's a privilege.
You two, Kevin and Scott, represent, and you've just told us about this in a phenomenal case that took you 7 years to get through, and it's still not done. You represent people who are gravely and seriously injured in traffic accidents, in many, many cases by drunk drivers. So, Scott, you have some pretty strong feelings about point whatever, zero, works for you better than any other point on the meter.
Zero works for a lot of Western European countries. In a lot of jurisdictions outside of North America, there's an absolute prohibition on any alcohol in your system. Now, Is that practical in Canada where we have our population spread so far?
Well, we have it for our learning young drivers in BC. If one drop in your system, you got an L on your car, you're done.
I think it's
That's zero, isn't it?
The problem is it's a slippery slope. If I can have one beer, that makes me 0.02. It's that next beer that puts you over. Once you start the progression, I mean, I've never talked to anybody, and I get to talk to a lot of people who've been driving cars drunk. I've never talked to anybody who set out to drive their vehicle drunk that day.
Of course.
It just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened because they knew at some point they could drive with some alcohol in their system, and for the most part, these people just miscalculated. And so I certainly, personally, I would support a zero level of alcohol.
What happens, though? And this may not be your jurisdiction necessarily, but if you're one of those people that gets pulled over at the side of the road 1 o'clock in the morning coming home from an evening out on the town, and you flunk the breathalyzer and you're in deep trouble in a heartbeat, sometimes you're going to want to talk to a lawyer. Who do you call? You don't call Murphy Battista because that's not the kind of law you practice. Who do you call?
Well, you're quite right. I don't profess to be an expert of any sort in
legal aid. I mean, if you don't have a lawyer on retainer, and most of us don't,
mm-hmm.
and it's 1:30 in the morning, and you're busted, and you don't have a car, and there's some large cop standing over there going, well, you cooked your own goose here, buddy. Deal with it. Well, don't you want to call a lawyer? What do you do, Scott?
The reason I like this is you don't have to call a lawyer. You call a cab.
I guess.
And anytime you can call a cab as opposed to a lawyer, I think we're winning in society.
You're going to save a few bucks along the way. So that's the best advice then. Just suck it up, go home, clear your head, and address the matter the next morning.
If anyone finds themselves in that situation, they're not without a right of review. Like if the police officer had no right or they acted improperly, the courts can review that decision, and they can reverse the police officer's decision. So there are, and those cases routinely take place. So they could consult a criminal lawyer.
Okay, so back to hiring a lawyer. And in a very circuitous way, I actually got to that, who you're going to call. So now we're back to hiring a lawyer. And whether it's for a personal injury matter, and I think I'd like to keep it in that category here with you two specialists in that area. So how do you go about it? Most of us don't have lawyers. Most of us only require the advice and input of a lawyer when we're in some kind of legal difficulty. And hopefully they don't come up very often. But Scott, when they do, how do you know who's going to work for you or not? How do you know who to hire?
Well, you have to find someone that you trust, right? I think that's the most important thing. You have to have someone that you have a relationship with. But, I mean, this is a very competitive space, personal injury work, and the reason is it can be very, very profitable work depending upon how you do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, all those ads we were talking about earlier on TV for law firms, they're mostly all personal injury law firms.
Well, the gem is that one that was run by that Louisiana lawyer during the Super Bowl, Jamie Casino.
Right.
It was, it was this heavy metal montage, and he was this successful criminal lawyer, and he gave it all up when his brother was slain at the hand of a criminal to commit himself to, pursuing justice for these victims. And just for poops and giggles, I went and checked out his website, and he still does criminal law.
Oh, okay.
I think the key thing is check the references of the lawyer. Talk to people. Interview 2 or 3 lawyers. It's not enough to see what they've settled their cases for. I think you should look at the cases they've actually taken to trial and talk to some of their clients. And ask for references.
Well, and this is a point that I think is huge in the course of securing a legal advice, and particularly in a case where you might, in fact, be challenged in open court. It would be critical, I think, Kevin, to know that the lawyer that's going to be in your corner has actually been to court and, in fact, might even be pretty good at it. Not all lawyers go to court, do they? Some lawyers will avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes with professionals, with doctors, with dentists, with lawyers, people expect that if they go to one of those professionals, all of them are going to do the same thing, and that's not necessarily the case. There's good dentists, there's bad dentists, there's good doctors, there's bad doctors, and that is true with lawyers as well. Most cases settle without having to go to court, but if you have a lawyer that's not prepared to go to court, of course the insurance company on the other side knows that, and they're able to get a settlement that's not beneficial to the client if they know the lawyer won't be able to take it to trial.
And that's the point that Scott made earlier, talking about Murphy Battista. If you want to, and you were saying, if you get a cold call from someone who just wants to know, do I need you? Do I need a lawyer? I've just been in a deal. ICBC is doing this to me, and you give them that call, and you say, you said at the end of that moment, you said you can tell them that you've been to see Murphy Battista, and chances are they will give you pretty much what you're asking for, because they know you go to court, and they know that if they end up squaring off against you guys, it's going to be a fight to the finish. You're not pushovers.
I hope we're not pushovers. I mean, we go to trial lots.
Yes,
we win lots, so I hope that means we're not pushovers.
No, but I mean in terms of the peace of mind from the client perspective, because the law, for most of us, is a real alien world, and we just are completely disoriented within seconds of entering it.
Yeah, a lot of people have this misapprehension that it's like a deal. You're buying a car, and it's not. It's an adversarial exercise, and it's not a tea party. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely not a tea party. And the bigger the case, the more serious the injuries, the more intense it gets.
Need to take a quick break here. We'll talk about the nuts and bolts of putting a case together. Our guests in studio are Scott Stanley and Kevin Gorley, lawyers from Murphy Battista, LLP. Online, by the way, if you want to take a moment during the break and check them out, it's murphybattista.com. By the way, Battista is Battista, murphybattista.com. Back with more on The Law Show after this.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is AM 650's The Law Show.